Well, a few months ago, the fire alarm rang out from a condo in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And Matt Busbice, in the wee hours of the morning, startled by this, he runs downstairs, mismatched clothes, kind of disheveled, gets downstairs, gets outside before he knows that there's actually not a fire, just an alarm. Anybody ever had that experience? So he runs out, and he's already up, and he's awake, and while he doesn't look the best, most presentable, he decides to walk a couple doors down, get a cup of coffee. And as Matt Busbice walks toward that door of the coffee shop, he realizes he didn't say his morning prayers. And so he steps to the side of the patio there, closes his eyes, and says a morning prayer. And when he opens them back up, he sees 9-year-old Kelvin Ellis Jr. walking toward him with a fist clenched. And before he knows what happens, that fist opens up, and 9-year-old Kelvin says, "If you're homeless, here's $1. And he offers it, his only dollar, his last dollar that he got because he got good grades. That's all he had, was this $1. But he'd always wanted to help a homeless person, and so he saw before him what he thought was his opportunity. What he didn't know is that Matt Busbice wasn't homeless. In fact, he'd sold multiple sporting goods stores and still owned one called Buck Feather, and he had millions of dollars. And so he takes Kelvin inside, he buys him a treat, he meets his father and tells his father how proud he should be of his son who so graciously and generously offered the only dollar he had to his name to help him out. As we rejoin the story of Jesus this morning in Mark chapter 12, we're going to find a story where Jesus celebrates someone who does something of the same, this woman, this widow who gives her last little bit, all that she has to her name, offers it so generously, so graciously. And Jesus looks at her and he celebrates her. Here we are 2,000 years ago. We're going to read her story right here. If you got a Bible, open it up, Mark chapter 12. And we're going to focus in on verses 41 through 44, but we're going to back up to verse 38 to get some context. All right, read it with me. Jesus, in the temple, as he taught, he said with these religious leaders and everybody else around, he said, "Watch out for the teachers of the law." They were right there listening. And they like to walk around in flowing robes, be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and have the most important seats in the synagogue and places of honor at the banquets. And they devour widows' houses for a show and make lengthy prayers. And these men will be punished most severely. And then Jesus went and sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put. And he watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. And many rich people threw in large amounts. But a poor widow came. And she threw in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a fraction of a penny. And calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put into the treasury more than all the others. They gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." Can you get the picture here of what's going down? So here's Jesus. He's been in the temple for a while now. We've seen him teaching and doing all these different things in the temple courts. Folks are crowding around, including the religious leaders. But Jesus doesn't worry about that. He still warns the crowd to watch out for these pious posers who do all these religious things so that they would get noticed by other people. And they're the important ones, right? They're the ones who have the best seats. They got the courtside seats. They got the best income. They got the designer threads. These are the people that you'd look at, and if you didn't know better, you'd think God's honoring them because they're honoring him. #blessed, right? That's what you would think when you look at these religious leaders, but they have gotten to where they are by taking advantage of the widows and the poor, he says. Their hearts are not for God, but for themselves. And so Jesus, after warning everybody about these religious do-gooders who are just so self-righteous, Jesus goes and sits down to do some people watching. Any other people watchers here? right? Yeah, it's okay to admit it. It's socially acceptable stalking. That's okay. But I was at Costco. I was going to pick up a pizza the other day, and these ladies are sitting there waiting for their food, and they're like, do you like people watching? Yeah, I like people watching. Man, it's really interesting. Look at, and they're like people. Some of you are like that. My wife, she's not here. I can say that. She totally likes people watching, right? She'll walk by. She'll be like looking in people's windows like, oh, I like what they've done there. Right? Some of us are people watchers. Jesus is with you, okay? Jesus sits down to do some people watching. And when he sits down to do this, he notices there's around the room, this temple court, there's 13 different shofar-shaped offering boxes, like ours in the back. They got them all around the court. And Jesus sits down and he watches, and some things kind of catch his eye. He sees the rich people. And the rich people come in with their Scrooge McDuck bags of gold, right? And he hears the loud clanging as they dump their gifts into the shofar-shaped offering boxes. They knew everybody could hear how much they were giving, and they liked it that way, Jesus says. It's obvious what they're giving. They're giving a lot. But then this widow approaches, right? Can you picture it? Silently, seemingly nothing in her hand to give, and she comes close, and she holds it up, and she drops in just 2 little coins. They barely make a sound. And then she, I imagine, still head drooping and a little bit of shame and not wanting to be noticed, hopeful anonymity, she kind of saunters away. And Jesus, though, he calls his disciples, he says, guys, look at her. Look at her. Look at what she's doing. And she felt those eyes looking at her, right? I mean, the rich people giving those big gifts, they wanted everybody to notice. This woman, the last thing she wants is attention. And she felt those eyes looking at her as Jesus says, guys, look at what she just did. Mark tells us that what this widow gave was 2 lepta. And the lepta was the smallest of all Greek coins. With the least value. We're told it's a fraction of a penny. We could call it your 2 pennies, right? But it's really less than that. Side note, did you know this is where we get our phrase, giving your 2 cents worth? True story. You don't realize how much of what we take for granted in our culture comes from the scriptures. So she gives her 2 cents worth. 2 cents, 2 lepta is really nothing. I mean, when we're walking, many of us, we see 2 pennies on the ground. We won't even bend down to pick them up because it's not worth our time. And yet this offering, this gift, Jesus celebrates it. It's the most famous donation in all of human history. Think about that. In 2,000 years, we're still talking about her. And Jesus says here that her sacrificial gift is more valuable than all the fortunes that the other rich people were given that day, than all the Rockefellers, all the Bill Gates, all the Warren Buffetts might give today. He says, no, look at her. Look at what she gave. And we are challenged to follow her example here. Now, for us to understand what this all means for us, we have to come to grips first with 2 realities, okay? 2 realities. First reality is this. We are all rich. If you're following along in your notes, you can fill this in. We are all rich. We resemble the rich in the story more than this poor widow. Did you know that? 10% of the world lives on less than $2.15 a day. If you've got more than $4,200 to your name, you're in the top 50% globally. If you've got more than $100,000 to your name, all your net assets, then you're in the top 10% globally. So you may not feel rich when you compare yourselves to others around you and you look at what they have and what you don't. You look at that stack of bills that's sitting on your desk. But by world standards, if you're here this morning, if you got to choose what you would eat this morning, if you got to choose what you would wear, if you drove a car here today or a golf cart, if you're online and you're accessing this through the internet, we are among the wealthiest in all of human history. And so we resemble the rich right here. Here's the second reality. We are all rich. The second reality is this. We are all so very poor. Do you know that? We are all so poor. A friend of mine was telling me a story about going to her high school reunion recently. And as she sat there, she had two friends who have both done really well for themselves, and they were sharing stories. And one of them in particular, who lives here in the area and has a nice home and a sprawling acreage, and he's kind of talking big about all that he's done in his life and how much he has. He's flipping through photos on his phone, and he's kind of showing off all that he's got with this other gentleman that he didn't know so well, but she did. And she knows that this other gentleman doesn't know. She knows what he doesn't. He lives up in Washington in a rich mansion with a train that goes through the house, around the house, and all these other crazy perks. And this man is sitting here showing off what he thinks is impressive, and he doesn't realize to him it looks like a shanty. Do you realize as we stand before God, we are all so very poor? And it doesn't matter what you think you have to offer God, what you think you have over somebody else. We have nothing to offer in light of God's riches and God's glory. And so there is a sense in which we resemble the rich in the story. That's true. But we're also represented by the widow right here. Did you notice she's called a poor widow? Not just a widow, a poor widow. Nearly all the widows in Jesus' day were poor. They were destitute, they were alone, no safety net, no social security, no life insurance, nothing like that would set them up when their husband were to die. They were all poor. So for Jesus to point it out, he hardly needed to mention it. So when he says she's a poor widow, he's really emphasizing, no. She's not just a widow. She's not destitute like everybody else. She is po. Like she can't even afford the whole word. She is po, And so that's what he's trying to communicate. And the same is true of us as we stand before God, my friends. We are po. Do you know that? Like we stand before God no matter how successful we've been in life, no matter how many zeros, no matter how many commas you have in your bank accounts, we see that we stand poor before God and desperately in need of his grace. We are like the church in Laodicea. Revelation 3 verse 17 says, you say, I am rich, I've acquired wealth, I don't need a thing. And Jesus says, but you don't realize you're wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. See, experiencing the riches of Christ, to truly experience the riches of Christ, we have to begin by acknowledging, by recognizing how very poor we are before him, how desperately in need of his grace we are. And only then can we access the riches of Christ. That's why Jesus once said in Matthew 5 verse 3, said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So what's true of us? What's true of us? We are so very rich, and yet we are so very poor. So as it turns out, I think we can see ourselves in the story. Do you see it now? Do you see it? You don't. Awesome. Okay, I'll try again with 1045. It's okay. It's okay. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to pretend you're still with me, okay? Considering these two realities, so if we're rich, we're poor, what then, the question becomes, what then do we do with all God has given us? What mentality do we bring to what God has given us? Two realities, now two mentalities. The first mentality that is so easy to slip into is the mentality of being an owner. It's the mentality of ownership. If we're owners, then all we have is ours. We've earned it. We deserve it. It's our name on the deed or the pink slip or the desk or whatever it is. We own it. And we worked hard for what we've got, and we get to decide what we get to do with it, right? And this is the attitude of the religious leaders. They lord it over the down and out. This is the attitude of the rich who are giving what would just get them noticed. But think about it. In our lives, when we start to think, well, I've earned it and I get to decide what I get to do with it, who gave you the ability to earn it? Who gave you the breath in your lungs? Who gave you the mind to achieve it? Who gave you the physical capacity? God did, right? So we owe him all of it. It reminds me when my kids were smaller, right? And when they were really young and they'd bring me that Father's Day gift or that birthday gift, right? And they'd bring it and they're so proud. But you know where they got the money to buy it? Right? You know, because you had the same experience. It's my money, right? Right? And they come and they're like, I got you a gift. And I'm like, I'm welcome. Yeah, right? I mean, like that's how it goes, right? And so don't we realize that in our lives, everything we have comes from God. We are owners of nothing, stewards of everything. And so this is the next mindset, is the one of stewardship, ownership versus stewardship. Stewardship says, I'm not the owner. I'm just a manager. I'm a custodian. I'm a keeper of it. Stewardship recognizes that what we have doesn't ultimately belong to us. Psalm 24 says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The world and all who live in it, right? We belong to God. Everything we have, it's simply entrusted to us for a time. Your money manager is a steward. Your bank that you deposit money into, they're a steward, right? You hope that they don't go and spend all your money saying, well, I thought it was mine. Your housekeeper is a steward. Your mechanic is a steward. Your caregiver for your child is a steward. They take care of someone that doesn't ultimately belong to them. We are stewards of what God entrusts to us for a time. That's what this poor widow understood. She recognized that what she had belonged to God, and that's why she could so freely give it back to him, even when she had nothing else. She said, it's not mine anyways. So how then can we follow her example? If we're going to be stewards like this, right? If we're going to honor this story, if we're going to live into it, how do we do that? I'm going to give you 4 principles of stewardship. In essence, how do we give our 2 cents that I see growing out of this story here? And the first one is this. First thing I see is that we're to give humbly. We're to give humbly. You know, our giving shouldn't be something that draws attention to ourselves or seeks to get something in return. We are so primed to always ask, well, what do I get out of the equation, right? But the moment we ask that question, our gift ceases to be a gift, right? Because we're looking for some payment in return. That's not a gift. And we're so programmed to do that. And Jesus specifically celebrates this poor widow for how she gives so humbly, so quietly. She doesn't draw attention to herself like these others that Jesus notices. Like the rich or the self-righteous religious leader, she simply gives from a pure heart to God. And so the question for us is, are we giving behind the scenes or are we giving to be seen? It's a question for us all to really grapple with. Are we giving behind the scenes or are we giving to be seen? This is a question, by the way, when I'm talking about stewardship here, I'm not just talking about our gifts back to the Lord, but in all of our personal relationships, right? When you give something to your husband or your wife or to your daughter or your son or to a friend, do you expect something in return or are you giving humbly, graciously, open-handedly, saying, no, this is free? This is all of our life and relationships here. You know, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, he warns us. Matthew 6, verses 1 through 4, he says, do your acts of righteousness, do not do them in front of others to be seen by them. Instead, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and then your Father who sees what's done in secret will reward you. And if we're giving to get recognized or to get our name on the building, to get our name on that brick that they're going to place, when we're giving so that there will be something in return, to leverage some power, and this happens in the church. Have we seen it? Praise God, I haven't seen it in my time here. Praise God for that. But this happens sometimes. We give and we try to leverage some power out of it. That's not a gift. That's not given humbly, and there is no room in God's church for that. See, Jesus calls us to give humbly away. Not just our finances, but who we are, to give it humbly. Second thing that I see, we're called to give proportionally. To give proportionally. We all have different levels at which we can give back to God. And some of us can give much, some of us can give little. And when you see Jesus here and he celebrates this poor widow, it's clear that God does not care so much about the amount you give as the heart with which it's given. In fact, Jesus comes and he seems to think that this poor widow actually gives more than the rich folks who give it as well. Now, that makes me think, like, is Jesus just really bad at math? You know, how does he think that's more? I mean, it's obviously not more, right? I don't think Jesus is bad at math. I think he's talking about how she gave proportionally more to what she had to offer than these rich folks who were skimming a little bit off the top, didn't even notice that it was gone. This is what Jesus is talking about. See, to help people practice this proportional giving, we find the idea of a tithe throughout Scripture. And a tithe simply means your first and your best 10%. And in some churches, it's a legalistic, we'll chase you down if you don't give 10%. I think that totally misses the idea here. See, as we go forward in the New Testament, we find that we're not called to a legalistic 10% or to simply even give 10%, but to radical and regular generosity. That's the calling of the New Testament. We see this widow who gives all she has, her whole life. We see the early church sharing everything they have. We see in the New Testament, we see Paul traveling around and the churches around the Roman Empire giving to those who are poor and down and out. We see them giving to further the gospel reach. This is what you see in the New Testament. The New Testament call is not just to measure out exactly 10%, but to give proportionally to our income and to tilt toward radical and regular generosity. That's what we're called to as believers. And so maybe a tithe is a good place to start. I was listening to a podcast a few weeks back by a man named Dr. Scott Galloway. Dr. G, as he's called, he's an atheist author, professor. He's an entrepreneur, kind of Renaissance man, doesn't believe a lick in God. And yet he says, you know what, I think it's a really good idea for us to give 10% away. He said, because at a certain threshold of wealth, happiness diminishes. And he goes on, he talks about how we have resources we can offer to those who don't have them. And he talks about how good it feels when you give away to help other people. He's an atheist. And he gets this biblical wisdom. I'm like, man, that makes sense. For many of us, 10% is quite a stretch. When we don't see a whole lot of financial margin right now, we're still staring at that stack of bills, right? 10% is quite a stretch. Maybe for you, the strategy would be, I'm going to start this month, I'm going to give away 2%. And next month, I'm going to give away 3%. And the month or two after that, I'm going to give away 4%. And you just gradually work your way to a goal of 10% or whatever it may be that God puts on your heart to say, I'm going to work my way there. Some of us were tempted to say, well, I'm going to push this off till I make more. I'll give more when I make more money. But let me be honest with you, you won't. And here's why. Barna has a study that revealed that the more money we make, the less we give. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? Because it's always going to be easier to give when you're making less than to give when you're making more. What do I mean? Give 10% of $1,000, that's $100. It's like a nice outfit, right? Okay? To give 10% when you're making 100,000, that's a little bit more money, right? It's a lot harder to part with 10K, right? And so the reality is you got to start somewhere. And if you don't start when you have a little less and start to say, I'm going to move in that direction, then you're never going to get there. Like personally, I'm just so grateful that I began this habit of giving proportionally back to the Lord when I was a teenager. I was a teenager and college student. Like I made no money. When I was starting in ministry too, I'm like, man, it's kind of laughable how much money I made, you know? And I'm glad I started then. Why? Because I created the habits and the neural pathways so that when I make more money now, it's a little easier to give back to God. What is His anyways? So here's the question for us to consider. Are you giving in line with your income? What percentage, honestly, are you giving back to God? Don't answer. Don't tell me. I don't want to know. I don't care. But I want you to talk to God about this. Maybe go home. If it's been a while since you've done the math, maybe go home, do some math. A friend of mine here at the church did this recently. They went home and they looked at it and they're like, oh man, we're falling behind. I thought we were giving this much. We're only giving that. And they said, we could totally give more. And I don't care about the dollars. God doesn't care about the dollars. But He looks at the heart and He says, thanks for honoring me with your heart. It's just a beautiful thing. If we're honest, see, many of us, I think, are in the habit of tipping God instead of tithing. Have you noticed everybody wants a tip? Right? I mean, you go and order a coffee. They don't even do anything for you. They're like, here, it's going to ask you a question, right? And you're like, you know what question it's going to ask, and you did nothing for me, right? Now, when you do something, we went whitewater rafting on Friday, right? Took the family. They all survived, which is cool. And so our guides, I'm like, you gave us a great time. We all lived. You get a good tip, right? You get a lot more than I tipped the coffee barista who didn't do anything for me. Anyways, some of us are used to tipping God, and we give a little bit off the top if we feel like it, instead of giving proportionally from what He's given us and belongs to Him anyways. First, we give humbly. Secondly, we give proportionally. Thirdly, we are called here to give sacrificially. Look again at this poor widow. Jesus says she has nothing to spare, no margin. All she had, she gave sacrificially, and Jesus celebrates her. See, the rich, they threw their riches in, but it wasn't sacrifice. It didn't hurt him at all. And he goes and he says, this widow, she sacrificed everything. For some of us, a proportional tithe is a stretch. And for others of us, giving 10% doesn't even start to scratch the surface of sacrifice. You know, we barely feel it. I know people who have been so blessed financially that they've set a threshold and said, you know what, I only need this amount to live on in our family, and we can enjoy life pretty well right here, and we're going to give away to the Lord's work, to missionaries, to local organizations, whatever it would be, to those who are poor and needy around us. We're going to give it away above that threshold because we don't really need it. I know other people who have the practice of a graduated tithe, and they've made the commitment that every year they're going to tithe a little bit more and bump it up 1% every year. I know other people who have been given so much by the Lord that they say, you know, we're going to reverse that tithe equation. We're going to live on 10%. We're going to live on 20 or 30% of what they make, and they have so much more that they can give back to the Lord's work. This is giving so sacrificially. It's a beautiful example, not one that all of us can follow, but there's something there. See, one of the reasons that the New Testament doesn't hold so legalistically to tithing as our standard is because it focuses entirely on what we give away and not so much on what we keep for ourselves. And I think we got to ask the question, how much do I really need to keep for myself? Or am I hoarding what could be used for God's kingdom? See, when we give what we don't need or what we don't want, or we just take some off the top, that's not sacrifice, is it? King David, one time he said, I will not offer a sacrifice that costs me nothing, because after all, that wouldn't be a sacrifice. C.S. Lewis comes along in Mere Christianity, and he has these words to say, and I love Lewis, and I love the way he puts this. He says, I do not believe we can settle how much we ought to give. There's no dollar amount to that. I'm afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare. In other words, if our expenditure on comforts and luxuries, amusements, etc., is up to the standard common among those with the same income as our own, then we're probably giving away too little. And if our charities do not pinch or hamper us at all, I should say they're probably too small. There ought to be things, Lewis says, which we should like to do, but cannot do because our charitable expenditure excludes them. Well, that stings a bit, doesn't it? Anybody else? I'm not going to get up here. I'm not going to preach this text and act like it doesn't sting me. It stings me. There are so many times where I have to talk back to God and be like, God, you sure you want me to give that to you? Because I can think of a lot of other ways I'd like to spend that money. See, I and we are so used to giving our spare time and our spare change that sacrifice really seems like a lot to ask. We're to give humbly, we're to give proportionally, we're to give sacrificially. Lastly, we're to give joyfully. To give joyfully. I told you the story earlier about 9-year-old Kelvin Ellis Jr. bringing his one and only dollar to Matt Busbis, but I didn't tell you the rest of the story. See, after this fact, they wanted to stay in touch, and so Busbis reached out to Kelvin, and he offered him a whole spending spree, shopping spree in his sporting goods store. And there's a video of Kelvin running around, grabbing what he can in these 40 seconds, just grab whatever he can, gets this bicycle, gets all these things. I mean, he's elated, but it's not ultimately what Kelvin wanted when he gave his dollar, tried to give his dollar away. He's asked by reporters, you know, what was it that you hoped for in giving your dollar away? And he said, joy. Joy. Because I helped someone. He said, give something away and you feel like you've got a lot of things from it. And the New Testament comes and echoes this 9-year-old. That we're to be glad in giving, not getting. Jesus himself, he said, it's more blessed to give than to receive. And the Apostle Paul comes later, 2 Corinthians 9 verse 7, says each of you should give what you've decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly, not out of compulsion, because God loves a cheerful giver. He loves joyful generosity. God cares ultimately about your heart, not your wallet, not what you can offer him. It's all pennies to him or less. And as Jesus watches these people putting their offerings in, it's not the big givers who are writing big checks, who are dumping in bags of gold. It's not those who catch his attention. It's this poor widow who has a pittance to offer. And he loves her heart. That's what we're called to embody. Carol's 89. Her husband left her after 24 years of marriage. And as she started looking for a job, God told her, listen, work for me and I'll take care of you. And for the last 30 years, she's worked for God, smuggling Bibles into all kinds of countries around the world where they're restricted. She's on the most wanted list in one of those countries, 89-year-old Carol, fugitive, right? And she recently traveled to China, saw angels intercede for her as she moved through customs in the airport. When her parents died, she inherited their home. And then eventually when she sold it, she was able to give $150,000 to her church. Like this lavish, generous gift from a poor widow who didn't have anything to offer on her own. She never worked in the last 30 years, never asked for money, and yet God always gave her more than enough. And when she was asked, why do you do such risky work? She answers, I'd rather be in God's will and risk my life than do something safe and be outside of God's will. That's joyful living and giving, is it not? That's saying, I'm in, God. I want to know you more as I give myself away. Ronald Rolheiser once wrote, when you act like God, you get to feel like God. Let me clarify what he means. What he means is God is a giving God. Do you know that? Do you believe that about his character? God is a giving God. For the joy set before him, he gave himself away. This is our God. And he's such a giver that when we join in giving ourselves away, like this poor widow did, like our God gives, when we get to give ourselves away in the same way, we get to feel a little bit like God feels, that joy that he experiences in giving. See, this is the joy that we get to experience as we give ourselves away. See, when we zoom out from this passage, we see that Jesus isn't just highlighting an example of stewardship or generosity. It's that too. I think we need to live ourselves humbly, joyfully, generously, sacrificially, proportionally, giving ourselves away constantly in our lives, not just financially, but in our time, in our energies, in our relationships. But more than this, Jesus, I think, in this passage, he's pointing to how in a few days he would give himself away. See, when Jesus, verse 44, says they all gave out of their wealth, but she, this widow, gave out of her poverty. She put in everything, all she had to live on. That word live is the Greek word bios. It's where we get biology from, right? The study of life. It means life. She gave away all her livelihood. She gave away her very life right here. And just 3 days later, Jesus himself would go and give away his very life for us. Embodying everything he saw through his self-giving, through his laying down his bios, his life, we get the invitation to life, Zoe life, forever. 2 Corinthians 8 verse 9 says, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. Jesus didn't just watch this widow so he could teach us a lesson about joyful giving. He saw what she did and giving away her very life so that we could see how he would give his very life so that we could experience life and salvation in him. In the end, this isn't about experiencing the joy of generous giving. That's not ultimately the point. The ultimate point is to experience the joy of new life in Christ. And any of our generosity, my friends, any of our generosity just barely scratches the surface of responding, of reflecting the incredible sacrificial generosity of our great God. Am I right? It just barely scratches that surface. So I'm going to invite the band back up, and we're going to respond to God with gratitude. this morning for all that he has given us. And maybe you're here and you don't have a saving relationship with Jesus yet, and you'd say, I want to know this God that you're talking about. I want to know this God that is so sacrificial, so generous, so giving, so gracious. And if that's where you're at, I want to invite you to come and to talk with one of our prayer partners that's going to be standing to the side here in this room, also in the family room. If you're online, you can send a simple text in to 94000 that says, tell me more. And we'd love to interact with you, answer any prayers you have as well. And if you're here and you would like to know more about a relationship with Jesus, come up, talk to somebody. Grab me in the lobby on your way out. But church, stand to your feet if you're able, and let's respond to our great God in praise and worship and gratitude now.